The Electrician. It started with a flicker. Amanda had just moved into a new house, a little place on the edge of town. It was old, at least 60 years, but charming. The kind of place that felt like it had stories woven into the walls, like the wooden floors had memories of the people who'd walked on them before. The house was cozy, maybe a little too cozy, but it had a character she couldn't resist, and it was affordable. On the second night, the flickering began. It was subtle at first, just the living room lights dimming for a second, then coming back to normal. The kind of thing you'd ignore if you were busy or just tired. But it kept happening, once in the evening, then again during the night. And by the third night, Amanda started to feel it in her bones. Something wasn't right. The lights weren't just flickering. Sometimes they stayed off for minutes at a time, only to come back on without explanation. The sound of the electrical hum from the walls started to feel like a distant voice, like something was whispering just behind the drywall, a voice that was there but not meant to be heard. It was enough to make her uneasy, but not enough to make her call someone yet. After all, she thought, it was an old house. Maybe it was a fuse or a short in the wiring. So, she called a local electrician, Samuel, a name she would never forget. When Samuel arrived, he was a man in his mid-50s, with thinning hair, thick-rimmed glasses, and a kind smile. His hands were calloused, his fingers stained with what Amanda assumed were years of working with wires and tools. He was polite but quiet, his presence oddly comforting in the midst of her growing anxiety. He didn't seem concerned when she explained the flickering lights. Instead, he gave a reassuring nod, pulled out a tool belt, and got to work. He started in the living room, unscrewing the light fixtures and inspecting the wiring with a flashlight. As he worked, Amanda couldn't help but watch him. There was something about the way he moved, the way his eyes would flicker over the room as if he were assessing it. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his hands not just touching the wires, but feeling them, as if they were more than just copper, as if they had some sort of significance. "Sometimes old houses settle," Samuel said, breaking the silence. "They shift. The wiring gets stressed. Nothing to be worried about." Amanda nodded, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It wasn't just the house settling. She felt something in the air, a kind of tension that was hard to place. The way Samuel worked, the way he studied the walls, it felt like he wasn't just fixing a problem. He was searching for something. He moved into the next room, and Amanda followed. He seemed to be drawn to the back hallway, where a dim light bulb hung precariously from the ceiling. He spent an unusually long time there, unscrewing the light bulb, inspecting the socket. The silence between them grew thick. Finally, Samuel looked up, his face serious. "You've been hearing things, haven't you?" Amanda's heart skipped a beat. What does he mean by that? What do you mean?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though she felt the panic creeping in. "Not just the lights. You've heard the whispers." The word landed like a weight in the room. Amanda's blood ran cold. She had never told anyone about the feeling she'd been having, the strange hum, the whispers at the edges of her hearing that seemed to fade whenever she focused on them. How did he know? Samuel didn't answer right away. He was staring at the light fixture again, his fingers brushing the edges of the socket. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Sometimes, the walls of a house have stories to tell, stories that don't want to be heard. He paused. But some people can hear them, even if they don't want to. The air around them thickened. Amanda's breath came faster now, and for the first time she felt trapped, not by the house, about the way he moved, the way his eyes would flicker over the room as if he were assessing it. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his hands not just touching the wires, but feeling them, as if they were more than just copper, as if they had some sort of significance. Sometimes old houses settle, Samuel said, breaking the silence. They shift. The wiring gets stressed. Nothing to be worried about. Amanda nodded, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It wasn't just the house settling. She felt something in the air, a kind of tension that was hard to place. The way Samuel worked, the way he studied the walls. It felt like he wasn't just fixing a problem. He was searching for something. He moved into the next room, and Amanda followed. He seemed to be drawn to the back hallway, where a dim light bulb hung precariously from the ceiling. He spent an unusually long time there, unscrewing the light bulb, inspecting the socket. The silence between them grew thick. Finally, Samuel looked up, his face serious. "You've been hearing things, haven't you?" Amanda's heart skipped a beat. What does he mean by that? What do you mean?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though she felt the panic creeping in. "Not just the lights. You've heard the whispers." The word landed like a weight in the room. Amanda's blood ran cold. She had never told anyone about the feeling she'd been having. The strange hum, the whispers at the edges of her hearing that seemed to fade whenever she focused on them. How did he know? Samuel didn't answer right away. He was staring at the light fixture again, his fingers brushing the edges of the socket. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes the walls of a house have stories to tell, stories that don't want to be heard." He paused. "But some people can hear them, even if they don't want to." The air around them thickened. Amanda's breath came faster now, and for the first time, she felt trapped. Not by the house, but by Samuel's presence. He didn't seem to notice. Instead, he stood up, wiped his hands on his pants, and gave her a tight, polite smile. "I've found the issue. It's not the lights. It's the wiring itself. It's older than the house. I'll have to replace it entirely. It could take a few days, but it's nothing major." Relieved, Amanda nodded and started to walk him to the door. But before he left, Samuel turned back. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice low. "You should probably know that the previous owners, well, they were strange. The couple that lived here before you, they knew something about the house, something they didn't want to leave behind. I'd be careful with the wiring in the attic, especially near the old circuit box. It's not safe." Amanda, feeling increasingly uncomfortable, forced a smile. "I'll keep that in mind. Thanks for your help, Samuel." He nodded and left. That night, as Amanda lay in bed, she tried to convince herself that Samuel was just a superstitious old man, just someone who believed in stories and folklore, not in the real world. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something that had been there long before she arrived. Days passed. The flickering lights became more intense, and the whispers grew louder. So loud, in fact, that she could sometimes hear them during the day. Soft voices, unintelligible but persistent. She tried to ignore them. She really did. And then, late one evening, Amanda went up into the attic. The house was quiet now, except for the whispers. She felt an impulse, a need to investigate, to confront whatever was happening. As she climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, the air grew heavier, the temperature dropped. The attic was full of old furniture, boxes, and the remnants of previous tenants. It smelled like dust and old wood, but there was something else, something electric in the air, like static, or the hum of a live wire. At the far end of the attic, near a small window, she saw it. A thick bundle of wires wrapped around an old circuit box, tangled and brittle. The wires were frayed, some of them sparking with tiny electrical bursts. And there, next to it, was a strange metal device. Small, ancient-looking, almost like an old radio. It was buzzing, faintly, as if it were on the edge of picking up a signal. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. No, the most unsettling part was that as Amanda got closer, she saw it, written in the dust on the floor, in what appeared to be some kind of dark fluid. It watches. It waits. Her breath caught in her throat. And then, for the first time, she realized Samuel had never left. As she turned to leave the attic, she saw him standing in the corner of the room. His glasses glinted in the dim light. Samuel was smiling, but it wasn't the polite smile from before. It was something darker, something colder. "I told you," he whispered. "The house has stories to tell, and now you're part of it." The lights in the house flickered, the hum grew louder, and Amanda suddenly realized the wiring had never been the problem. It wasn't the lights, it wasn't the circuits, it was him. And just as she turned to flee, she heard it, the whisper again. "You'll never leave." The house still stands on the edge of town, and people still hear the strange hum, the whispers in the walls. But the electrician, no one's seen Samuel since that night. Some say he's still in the attic, waiting for the next person to arrive. And sometimes, just sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can hear the faintest of whispers. It's coming. The butcher's secret, the neighborhood delicatessen, Rossi's Fine Meats, had been a fixture on Maple Street for over 50 years. It wasn't flashy, just a small red brick shop with a striped awning and a faded neon sign that buzzed faintly in the evenings. But it had a reputation for having the freshest cuts of meat in town. The Rossi family had owned it for generations, and though the patriarch, Mr. Lorenzo Rossi, was now an elderly man, he still ran the place with meticulous care. Everyone in the neighborhood shopped there. The steaks were impossibly tender, the sausages perfectly spiced, and the sandwiches so good they felt like a sin. Even skeptics who swore by supermarket convenience found themselves drawn back to Rossi's, unable to resist its savory allure. But something about the shop always felt off. Maybe it was the way Lorenzo's sharp eyes lingered just a second too long on his customers, sizing them up like he was imagining more than just their orders. Or the fact that the meat always seemed plentiful, no matter the season or supply chain disruptions. Rumors swirled. Some said Lorenzo had a secret farm. Others joked that he was smuggling exotic game. No one could explain why, but the deli had a way of sticking in the back of your mind, like a shadow that didn't quite belong. The day Nora went missing was when people started to really talk. She was just 17 with a part-time job delivering sandwiches for Rossi's. Quiet, shy, the kind of girl no one paid much attention to, until she didn't show up for her shift. Her parents were frantic, and the police combed the neighborhood, but there was no trace of her. Her bike was found leaning against the side of the deli, its tires muddy, but that was it. When questioned, Lorenzo shrugged, his demeanor calm but detached. She came in, picked up her deliveries and left. Haven't seen her since. The police accepted his statement. After all, Lorenzo Rossi was practically a local institution. But whispers began to spread. People started noticing little things. The way the smell from the deli seemed stronger after dark, thick and cloying, like meat left too long in the sun. The way Lorenzo began to close the shop earlier than usual, locking the heavy steel door with a loud echoing clang. And the way the sandwiches, which had always been irresistible, seemed different. The flavor was richer, the texture softer, almost melting in your mouth. Lena, a single mom new to the neighborhood, was the first to confront him. "My daughter's been sick," she said one afternoon, her voice sharp and accusing as she stood at the counter. "She threw up after eating your roast beef. I want to know what's in it." Lorenzo's eyes glinted as he leaned forward, his expression calm. "Fresh, high-quality beef," he said evenly. "Nothing more." But Lena wasn't satisfied. That night, long after the shop had closed, she drove back and parked across the street. She watched as the lights in the deli flickered on, and Lorenzo emerged from the back room wearing a stained apron. He carried something large and wrapped in thick, waxy butcher paper to the alley behind the shop. Curiosity turned to dread as Lena crept closer, her heart pounding. She peered around the corner just in time to see Lorenzo hoisting the bundle into a heavy metal freezer. The door creaked as it swung shut, and for a split second, Lena thought she saw a hand, small, pale, and lifeless, slip free from the edge of the wrapping before it disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, Lena went to the police, but without proof, they dismissed her as hysterical. "He's been running that shop for decades," one officer said, shaking his head. "You're imagining things." Frustrated, Lena took matters into her own hands. That night, she returned to the alley, this time armed with a flashlight and bolt cutters. She waited until the lights in the shop went out and the street was quiet before making her move. The freezer was massive, its surface frosted over. Her hands shook as she forced the lock open, the metal giving way with a loud snap. The door creaked open, and a wave of icy air rushed out. Inside, rows of neatly wrapped packages were stacked on metal shelves, each labeled with a date and a single initial. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but as she moved the packages aside, her flashlight caught something that made her stomach lurch. A clump of hair, matted and frozen, poking out from one of the bundles. Lena tore at the packaging, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Inside was a severed arm, the skin bluish and frozen, the fingers curled in a grotesque claw. She stumbled back, dropping the package, her flashlight clattering to the ground. Before she could run, a shadow loomed behind her. She turned, and there was Lorenzo, his face cold and expressionless. "You shouldn't have done that," he said softly, his voice devoid of emotion. The next morning, Rossi's Fine Meats was closed. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Closed for inventory." Lena's car was found abandoned 2 blocks away, but there was no sign of her. Her disappearance barely made the news. In the weeks that followed, business at Rossi's seemed to boom. The sandwiches were better than ever, customers said, so tender, so flavorful. Lorenzo smiled as he served his customers, his sharp eyes glinting as he watched them take their first bite. But some nights, if you walked past the deli after dark, you might hear faint whispers coming from the alley. A girl's voice, trembling and faint. "Help me, please." The smell from the shop lingers longer these days, heavier, thicker. And every so often, someone notices a new initial on the packages in the freezer, initials no one can quite account for. And still, people keep coming back, because once you've had a taste of Rossi's, you can't seem to stay away. When I was in my very early 20s, my mom and I shared a house. We had a stalker. The first night we stayed in the house, someone got into our car. My mom happened to come outside, saw him, set off the panic alarm on the car, and scared him away. My backpack had been in the car, and he dumped the contents into the floorboard of the car, but left the paycheck that I had just cashed, all the cash still in a bank envelope. The police said it seemed that they were searching for something specific and really questioned me about what that might be. But I have no idea. Police were able to get a partial palm print off the car, but had no matches in their system. My mom and I were out doing yard work and found a phone cord under our deck. It connected into the phone box on the outside of the house. We called the phone company out, and they said that they figured that someone had been using the cord to hook up a phone and lay under our deck and listen in on our phone calls. They removed the cord and put a lock on the phone box. We also frequently heard someone walking outside our windows at night. We would call the police and they would drive by but not see anyone. Another time, all of the light bulbs from our exterior lights were removed. Once we came home and my mom realized that a pair of earrings and a stuffed animal that had been sitting on her dresser were missing. There was no sign of anyone having broken in, but those items never turned up, and we were sure someone had been in the house. We frequently heard this weird thump and squeak noise that we could never figure out what caused it. Another time, my mom was raking leaves at the front of the house and saw something in one of our bushes. It was a voice-activated recorder, wrapped in black plastic and tied to the trunk of one of our bushes. The recorder was tapped into our phone line. Someone had gotten under our house, drilled a hole through our foundation, and run a phone cord through the hole into the recorder in the bush. We have no idea how a neighbor, though they were all elderly, didn't see or hear this happening. The police, who were well aware of the issues by this point, now seemed to realize that this was a serious, scary problem. They sent several officers out to investigate the recorder. We were in the house talking to an officer and heard the thump-bonk squeak noise that we always heard. We told the officer, "That's the noise we can't identify." As it turns out, at that moment an officer was crawling under the house and had bumped a pipe. He was able to repeat the noise. The police figured that it was almost impossible to get into or out of the crawl space under our house without bumping that pipe. And we heard that noise a lot. The police think that whoever it was getting into the crawl space and lying under the house listening to us. We put a cover over the entrance and glued it down. We put sequins in a certain order in the glue so that we could tell if it had been removed and re-glued. It was all insanely creepy. We eventually moved. I moved in with my boyfriend, now husband, on a second-floor apartment. I felt so much safer with people all around and figured that the stalking issue was behind me. Not long after we moved in, I noticed that our caller ID wasn't working. I called the phone company and they informed me that a Mr. Kramer had called and requested that the caller ID service be turned off on our phone. I had a meltdown. I was so upset, first off, because the phone company let some random person make changes on our phone line, and secondly, because apparently the issues were not behind me, and they were planning something and didn't want the caller ID to show up. I put a password on our account so no changes could be made without it, and that was the last issue we ever had. I really think the caller ID issue was possibly unrelated. Maybe someone was accidentally making changes to the wrong account or something. Either way, it was very creepy, though I have to admit. If the person had wanted to do something bad to either one of us, there were surely plenty of times that could have been done. It really seems they just wanted to observe us and scare us.